You know how a tyrant is made? It's when a leader takes away your rights and freedoms one by one, all while convinced that he's doing it for the greater good. In the case of Canada, we've seen the Justin Trudeau government try to stifle the single greatest force for freedom in the modern world, and that's the internet. I think the conversation you're about to see between Jordan Peterson and Rex Murphy over Canada's Bill C-11 is the most blunt repudiation against internet censorship and regulation we've seen in a long time. Just take a look at this before we get into it.
I know Canadians don't understand this, but let's say that the new media, which is the internet itself, was capable of producing some of the opposition to the globalists and Trudeau that the legacy media have abandoned. And I'm thinking of people like, say, Russell Brand, who's on the left, and not to mention, any of the conservative commentators in the United States. But Now what the Bill C-11 has done is basically, and this is unbelievable, I can't believe I read it correctly, they basically defined all internet content of any sort as subject to the same CRTC, Canadian Radio and Television, Corporation? I don't remember the last word of that acronym.
It doesn't really matter.
No, it doesn't matter. They've defined them as broadcasters that are equivalent, let's say, to CBC or CTV. Now, the reason that those broadcasters are different was because the government had to parse up the airwaves because the airwaves were actually a scarce resource. Now, and the internet is not a scarce resource. And now, as far as I can tell, reading Bill C-11, which is an unbelievably vague document, if a internet service provider, a private one, so a small business person like me, let's say, doesn't broadcast in French and English and in indigenous languages and to any diverse range of people with disabilities highlight Canadian content, then the government can do what it needs to do to deprioritize their distribution. And they'll do that by putting pressure on the search engine providers like YouTube and Google, or just stopping them altogether. And I read this bill, and all of it, again, Rex, too, the bill is couched in all this diversity, inclusivity, and equity terminology, which it's the same solution to every problem, right? And so not only do we have this massive press collusion with the government that's absolutely unconscionable in a Western democracy, but we also have now the government clamping down more viciously than in any other developed country on the freedom for Canadians to get access to all of the information on the internet, not just that produced by Canadians.
You know what's interesting? There's some parallels that can be drawn to the attempts to repeal net neutrality in the US back in 2017, which gave companies like internet service providers the ability to throttle speeds or promote content according to a certain dictates and incentives. Sure, in the case of Canada, it's the government and not the corporations, but I think the same answer is a relevant one here. Internet content is not bound by limited bandwidth, and neither does it have limited time slots like traditional media. And more importantly, it doesn't need a government to shepherd along what content deserves more visibility on the internet and what doesn't. Remember one thing about any government that is turning authoritarian: every time they move the goalpost and tread 1 inch closer to your protected rights in the name of the greater good, that is the time to panic and push back. In the case of Bill C-11, that supposed greater good is the visibility of Canadian content to viewers inside the country, and more importantly, those of native or disadvantaged backgrounds. And what do they get in return? They get to have the first reins attached to the online world to regulate it in a similar manner that it does TV broadcasting. It's pertinent to mention here that Bill C-11, also called the Online Streaming Act, eventually did make it to royal assent in Canada, which is the final step before an act becomes official law in the country. That happened last year in April, and I've not seen anyone talk about the dangerous precedent it sets for internet censorship and shadow banning. That means the Trudeau government has largely been successful in this sleight of hand, and it's given them more legal tricks up their sleeve to try and control the content that Canadians see on the internet.
I'm inclined to believe that this idea that these intellectuals, it's mainly a shallow cabinet. I don't care how condescending that sounds, but it mainly is. That they somehow or other have been given Vatican-like infallibility to judge what is correct and is not correct, to make decisions that will hold back. By the way, the whole idea of disinformation and misinformation coming out of the mouths of this government. I mean, they are the greatest purveyor of confusion and evasion and the idea that they then are going to be the kind of grandmas or Mrs. Grundy, as it used to be called in the 19th century, and protect the tender sensibilities of minds that are better than their own. You know, I'm tired of people, and I'm sure you are too, because it's getting so cliched, to bringing up George Orwell, but because he put the stamp on it and gave the template. The idea that a central authority runs thought and speech and makes judgments on what is and what's not. And under the banner of diversity, inclusion, and equity, which is really a hidden ideology pumped up by vast self-righteousness and granting pseudo-infallibility to those who are sensitive. We know this is not the case. Mr. Trudeau got rid of his only Aboriginal female minister. There's equity, there's diversity. They confuse, this is a big point too, they confuse either at Davos, which you referenced, or at any other high meeting, with saying that you are virtuous is the same thing as being it. And there's there's a blatant arrogance attached to any government that thinks that in the modern communication system, that it should have any business outside of the exact things that are defined by law as incitement and real rabid hate. They will call hate something they simply don't like. It's not an easy emotion to define.
Understand that governments in the 21st century salivate at the idea of shutting down the free flow of online information, and they'd love nothing more than to attach strings and to control it. Have you read the classic in dystopian literature called Fahrenheit 451? The book's a scary exploration of exactly this desire of the ruling class and the lengths they're willing to go to justify it. In the plot, the United States is taken over by a regime that wants to consolidate control and public support, but books which are widely circulated and read are making that job very difficult. So under the pretext of keeping social order and shielding people from unhappiness, the government initiates a nationwide drive to burn all books in existence, barring none. The novel's more than 70 years old, but it's truly a revelation at how great the desire is in governments to control the flow of information in the population, no matter which medium is most popular at the time. It's something to ponder over that in the 21st century, it would be Canada of all countries that would introduce a bill like C-11. The bill is left deliberately vague in its provisions and yet painfully clear for its true intentions. The control particularly applied to what the bill called streaming platforms, and that includes Netflix, Amazon Prime, and others. More interestingly, that also includes YouTube under the definition, which has arguably become a modern-day safe haven for open and long-form political discourse. In fact, there was actually a considerable degree of friction between YouTube and the Canadian government at the time, with YouTube even putting up ads in Toronto subways to make Canadians aware of how the platform was being stifled by their prime minister. More scathing was YouTube's response during and after the bill was finally made part of the Canadian law. Here's what the platform wrote to inform its users in the country. And I quote, "After hundreds of thousands of letters to MPs, senators, witness testimony, and creator videos, it is deeply troubling that a reasonable compromise was rejected that not only responded to the concerns of Canada's digital creators and users, but also reflected the government's own stated intent with regards to user-generated content." But when the bill was finally passed, YouTube came out with a disappointed message at what it means for internet freedom in Canada. And I quote, "A few days ago, the Online Streaming Act passed through the Senate and received royal assent. While we are disappointed that the concerns of thousands of Canada's digital creators and Canadian users were not reflected in the final outcome, we will continue to support our creators and users throughout the next steps in the process." The backlash against the bill was clear when even Canada's most celebrated writer, Margaret Atwood, jumped in to defend internet freedom, saying this, and I quote, "Bureaucrats should not be telling creators what to write." It's clear that all of that fell on deaf ears as the Canadian government just rolled past all counter-arguments after passing the bill.
Here's the reason that he may really admire China, because China, it happens to be communism in that case. China is fired only, as was Russia, by an ideology, by a set of narrow ideas from which no deviation, no criticism, under penalty of exile or death is allowed. Not as hard over here. But DIE is an ideology, and ideology makes those claims and fills those who hold it with a completely unacceptable level of moral certitude, not certainty. Bill C-11 is a disaster. And one more quick point. It is shameful. It is shameful to the essence that the main Canadian press are not as one voice and a one intense voice saying, we're not having this. We are simply not having this. You are not going to rule on what is information and not information. You are not going to rule on the presence of citizens on the new channels of communication. And seeing you've already fouled the official or legacy means to some serious degree, we're certainly not going to allow you to put a pillow over the mouth of the only possible new exchanges that we have. It's a terrible idea. And apart from arrogance, righteousness, and the belief in his own infallibility, I can't see why. But why aren't the MPs even in his own party saying, Justin, you're dreaming. You're out of touch. We don't want to go there. We're not following you on this. Where's the courage in any of these caucuses?
Canadians won't even know what information is being hidden from them because the laws will take the form of invisible algorithms that merely deprioritize at the listing of content that doesn't meet the impossible criteria that have been laid down. And Bill C-11 is basically written in a way that allows the government to interfere with the promulgation of any information that they deem unacceptable for any reason. Because there are so many restrictions on what you're allowed to do now that there's no possible way that any member of the alternative media can meet the criteria. It's just not possible. And it won't just be YouTube broadcasters and podcasters. It's going to be people who provide all sorts of services online because the bill is written in such a vast manner that the provision of any services on the internet, and we're talking about the internet here, right, which is something people really depend on, that'll all fall under the invisible auspices of a tiny coterie of ideologically addled bureaucrats and algorithms.
Honestly, that should always have been expected. We've seen a similar kind of deliberate vagueness in language with Bill C-16, which wrote gender pronoun mandates into law, and we may be seeing something similar with the upcoming Bill C-63 that takes aim to hate speech laws to the online world and social media. That means that before Trudeau leaves office, there will already be enough legal structures in place that fundamentally change the free and democratic nature of Canada, and they will be very hard to uproot for any new government unless it has a strong majority. But if there's one place that still forms the greatest bulwark against government censorship and thought policing, it's the internet and social media. Perhaps we'd be best advised to use them wisely in the fight against any creeping authoritarianism from the government.